Howdy ho, neighborinos. We are back. Okay, so we are on the last day of last week, which was week 6. This was Friday the 21st. So I chose to do this one in a video all on its own because this is the day that we heard from Jake Wagner's ex-wife. Yes, he had an ex-wife. He married her very shortly after they moved to Alaska. I'm sorry, my hair's like flipping on my neck and it's bugging me. He met and married her shortly after they moved to Alaska, and she ultimately moved back here with them. And yeah, so we're gonna get into her shit because there is some shit to unpack here. First of all, thank you all very much for coming back. Thank you all for sharing. Thank you all for telling your friends and everyone else who is just as obsessed with this case. I'm sorry that I'm not able to do daily updates at this point. I am not a full-time content creator. I am not a full-time YouTuber. There is a YouTube channel that other people have been sharing on the Facebook groups I'm in. I haven't watched her videos, but I'm sure that they're okay, even though last week I did see that she was sharing a bit of misinformation. I mean, I'm sure I have too, so I don't think that's that big of a deal. Just, keep in mind that anybody you listen to, me or anyone, is just a true crime fan. Like, we are just true crimers. We are nosy bitches. We are just people who are interested in this case because it was such a big deal and affected so many people. And we just want to see justice for this family. And if you truly sit and think about the things that happened to the Roden family at the hands of the Wagner family, it is disgusting and it is heartbreaking. And to think about something like that happening to you or your family is just absolutely devastating. And some of these details are hard to hear, and some of these details we get wrong. And none of us are, well, I wouldn't say none of us. Most of us are not claiming to be professionals. I am not an attorney. I am a hairstylist. I do not know what I'm doing. I just know how to read an article summary, and then we just converse about it here because we're all just nosy bitches here. Not that anybody said anything or anything, but I just want to make sure that expectations are managed around here. Like, I do not in any way know what the fuck I'm doing. So we can all just be fucking confused together. That being said, let's get into Elizabeth Armour's testimony. Head on over to the first part. Welcome back, friends. We are on part 1 of day, I don't even know what day this was, but this was Friday, October 21st. This was the testimony of Elizabeth Armour, Armer. This is the ex-wife of Jake Wagner that he met and married in Alaska, brought back to Ohio. She bailed and divorced his ass. So let's get into her testimony and let's discuss. First things first, going to go ahead and put a trigger warning on this episode and all of the following. There is going to be some discussion of the children. None of it's real bad, but there were some accusations that were thrown around that were not proven to be true. And there is a mention of a wedding night gone awry where there is some SA and some non-consensual things that were going on. There's just a lot of abuse in this relationship in general, just kind of as a common thread of the Wagners, that every relationship they had was not a pleasant, functional, or non-abusive one, basically. So Elizabeth Armour was called to the stand. There was an objection right off the bat because the defense apparently did not know that she was coming. And they also objected, well, they knew she was coming that day, but they had objections because they had wanted to speak to her neighbors, but the prosecution would not release her address to the defense because Elizabeth did not want to be found or talked to by anyone other than the prosecution. She was not interested in that. And the defense basically said they wanted to talk to her neighbors, basically making her out to be like a nutcase or something. So that's super fun and kind of right on brand for these morons. So there's that. But we're going to it was obviously overruled. Her testimony went forward, and and I'm also going to go ahead and say that they were absolute assholes to her on cross-examination. But yeah. So Elizabeth Armour, I will call her Elizabeth or Beth. She went by Beth at the time. She goes by Elizabeth now. She grew up all over the place. She said that she was a military kid, and ultimately her most significant upbringing was in a Amish Mennonite community in Tennessee before she moved to Alaska to finish her high school education at a church up there, because Amish Mennonite communities only educate through 8th grade. So that's how she ended up in Alaska. So head to part 2. Welcome back to the testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 2. So she met Jake at this church where the school was affiliated through, and she said that she only saw Billy and George at the church once or twice, and that Jake and Angela had come to this church. And at first, she thought that Jake and Angela were a couple, which, you know, if you've been around this group for a minute, you kind of know where we feel about that. So fucking gross. All right. So she said that she did not know anything about the Wagners, and at one point the pastor had found out about what had happened back in Ohio and actually made a point to talk to the congregation and tell them that, you know, nothing. He said the pastor told everyone he had known them back in Ohio, and the family was bothered by the news stories that were circulating around, and that the church should ignore it and welcome them into the congregation and into their community. So at this church, naturally, Jake has been without a woman for a whopping year at this point. So, you know, he naturally needs to find some other naive victim to latch onto. So he did. And she said that she had volunteered in the nursery some, and that he saw her from one end of a hallway. She saw him staring at her. I can't, seriously. She did tell Jake that she was not comfortable going on a date with someone she didn't know. So Jake then made an effort to talk to her. They would go out to get food, to get ice cream. They'd take Sophia. They would go get walks. And then they would just spend time together. Which, if the man hadn't slaughtered an entire family, I mean, honestly, sounds like a decent start to a relationship. And if we didn't know how this ended, I can kind of see why she didn't think it was going to end the way it did. He, of course, told her about his ex-girlfriend in Ohio being murdered, that the family was being hounded by the media and accused of things, and that sort of thing. And then, you know, basically just hoodwinked her into thinking he wasn't a complete piece of shit. You know, the usual. So before they were married, she only met Jake's family a couple of times. And Jake had lied to her and said that he was running the place that they were living. His family was living with him because they had fallen on hard times. And he was renting them space in his home. I mean, I don't know at what point you thought she wasn't going to figure this out, but she's going to fucking figure it out. So 9 months after meeting, he proposed. She said that there was a cultural difference and that she thought at that point she was expecting a proposal. So go to the next part. Testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 3. So like I said, Elizabeth Armour was from a Amish Mennonite community that she had spent a decent amount of time in Tennessee. She explained to the jury and the audience in the courtroom that it was not unusual in the community that she grew up in for a couple to hang out, date, meet in church, hang out, date, and become engaged within a year. So at the 9-month mark, 6 months of dating, 9 months of knowing one another, she stated that she actually was expecting a proposal because to her, that was the next logical step that she had always known. So originally they had agreed to be engaged for 2 years to get to know each other more. That didn't happen. Basically, Jake moved their wedding up multiple times. Not real sure exactly why, but I don't know what logic he gave her, other than she's gonna figure out he's a big fat liar. But ultimately, they ended up getting married about a month or so later. So the wedding was held in a friend's cabin in Alaska and was officiated by a friend of theirs who was a pastor. Again, there's a trigger warning for what comes next. Elizabeth did say that their wedding was beautiful, that she did have her friend as her maid of honor, and that they had a calm wedding in the cabin, even though Billy and George had spent the reception skulking in the corner. So that night, being their wedding night, they went to a hotel and they checked into a hotel for this one night. And Elizabeth, I'll just read what she says. She says, quote, I hadn't dated anybody and didn't have any experience with men, so I had requested in no uncertain terms that we not consummate the marriage on that night, which Jake agreed to, but did not honor. Are we fucking surprised? So not only... So apparently he's just a big fan of forcing himself on girls, and honestly, apparently age don't matter because Hannah was fucking like 14. I do not know how old Elizabeth was at this point, but I think she would have been late teens, if not 20 or so. So after she was, assaulted on her wedding night by her brand new husband, while laying in bed afterwards, he asked for her banking information, her passwords, her passcodes, her social security number, and synced her phone to his so that he could see every fucking thing she did. Don't waste any time, Jakey. Head over to part 4. Testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 4. Naturally, on the wedding night after he was laying in bed with her after assaulting her, his new wife, he asked for all her personal information, social security number, passcode, synced her phone to his, etc., the usual abusive behaviors. He also asked her to cut ties with her family. Based on the logic, she said she believes she was allowed to talk to her mother still, but basically based on the knowledge that as a child, 2 of Elizabeth's brothers had, as she put it, sexually experimented with her. So essayed her, as a child on separate occasions. So we all know how the Wagners feel about that sort of thing. And although they're big fans of doing it, apparently, they are absolutely terrified that it's going to happen to one of their grandchildren. They literally left the next morning and left from Alaska to head to Missouri. Apparently, they told her that they were going to farm in Missouri. And at some point, she found out that what Jake told her wasn't true about the whole, his family living with him because they fell on hard times thing. And that sucks. So they were looking at a farm in Missouri that Jake promised her that his family would live on one side of the property and that he, Elizabeth and Sophia would live on their own on the other end of the property. So in a similar situation that a lot of farming families and just families in general do. I grew up in a family like this that we lived in property that butted up against each other. So my grandparents lived across the road, and my uncle lived next door. Even though we were not right next to each other, there was a decent amount of property between our houses. George, Jake, and Billy drove one vehicle, and Angela and the children were in another vehicle going back. And Armour herself, which is Elizabeth, she was left behind in Alaska and was going to... There had been a delay in her passport, I think. Something about her passport so that she couldn't... drive through Canada. So she ultimately flew to Missouri from Alaska. So when she got to Missouri, she found an interesting setup. So I assume that she was under the assumption that when she got there, her husband, Sophia, would probably have their own hotel room and the rest of the family would have another one while they were finding some place to stay. She might have even been under the impression that they were going to go there and find some place to go straight to the new house. But that's not what happened. Turns out the whole damn family was staying in one single hotel room. Go over to part 5. Testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 5. So she arrives in Missouri, finds out the whole damn family is staying in the same little hotel room. Now, I'm going to reiterate for clarification purposes here. Billy, Angela, George, Jake, Elizabeth, Bullvine, Sophia. 7 people. 5 full-grown ass adults and 2 children in one hotel room. Absolutely fucking not. She testified that her and Jake slept in one bed, that Angela and the children slept in the other bed, that George slept in the recliner, and that Billy slept in the truck. On cross-examination, when we get to that, they did try to question this, and she says no, that she saw George asleep in that recliner. Why that would matter, I don't fucking know, but here we are. She said ultimately they stayed in that hotel for 5 to 7 days, which sounds like absolute fucking misery. However, during that 5 to 7 days, maybe a day or 2 out of it, George left to take Billy back to the Flying W farm in Ohio and then came back to Missouri. She testified that she didn't know if that's where they went, but that's what she was told, and that George and Billy left to go to Ohio and only George came back. She said while they were gone, her, Jake, Angela, and the children would drive around looking for jobs and places to stay or farms for sale because, you know, the one that they said that existed apparently fucking didn't. Ultimately, Angela rejected several of these properties because she didn't like this or she didn't like that or this or that or what the fuck ever. It really doesn't matter because all of this was just a plan to get her to come back to Ohio with them because at this point she was away from Alaska. She was stuck with them. So now she was coming back to Ohio. She was very upset because she said Jake had basically promised her that they were never coming back to Ohio because of the news story. But after being in this hotel with this group of wacky ass people, that she said all they did was yell. The whole time that she knew them, all they did was yell, and that she was so put off by that because she did not grow up in that kind of family that she thought anything would be better than staying with these morons in a hotel room. So she said, okay. So they moved back to South Webster, Ohio, which is in Scioto County. That is where Rita Newcomb, who is the mother of Chris Newcomb and Angela Wagner, she lived, and they moved into Angela's father's house, which was next door to Rita Newcomb's house, which I have further questions about, but I mean, whatever. So this house was small. It was a brick ranch. There is a picture of it somewhere. I'll see if I can find it real quick. This is the house in South Webster. So as you can see, brick ranch, kind of small. Here's their signature trailers that they use to haul all their shit around. So this is where they were living. Definitely kind of a small house for that many people, but not that bad. So go over to part 6. Testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 6. So upon moving into the house in South Webster, which was Angela Wagner's father's house, Elizabeth stated that they immediately began painting the house. And I've seen pictures of other houses that they've lived in, and Angela had a very specific paint scheme for any house that she was living in. The kitchen was red, living room was brown, the bedrooms, one bedroom was pink and one bedroom was blue. She said she didn't remember what color they painted the other bedroom, but I don't know. It doesn't really matter. The Wagners would do this because should anyone question the children's well-being and CPS come or something like that, the pink room was Sophia's very own room and the blue room was Bullvine's very own room, even though that is not the actual sleeping and living arrangements. Should there be any kind of visits or whatever, they could show how well off these children were. So George slept in the blue bedroom. Angela and Bullvine would sleep in the, I assume, master bedroom. The primary bedroom. We don't call them master bedrooms anymore. Apparently, I learned that on TikTok, which makes sense. But anyway, they slept in the primary bedroom, and Jake and Elizabeth slept in the pink room. Usually, Sophia would sleep with Angela because by this point, Jake and George had gone back to working. They were working for, I believe at this point, R&L Truck Lines, which is a semi-transportation company. They do week-long transports all over the place, but they would be home on weekends. So when they were home on weekends, typically Sophia would sleep in the room with Jake and Elizabeth, and when they were gone, the children would sleep with Angela. So, of course, not long after this, Elizabeth's relationship with her mother-in-law went south and soured. Not surprisingly, Angela is fucking impossible to get along with. So there's that. And she's doing things to her precious baby. We all know how that ended for Tabitha. Also, at this point, Billy was living at the Flying W full time, supposedly taking care of his father. I don't know. I don't know about that. That whole thing was kind of sketch, but whatever. So, upon moving to Ohio, they pretty quickly started coaching Elizabeth on what they thought to be true. Namely, that BCI was always listening, BCI was always watching, they were trying to be frames, they didn't want her going outside, they wanted to know everybody she talked to, what she said. They impressed that the boys would never wear tennis shoes, they always wore boots, that sort of thing. So go to the next part 7, I think. Testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 7. So, as further part of her coaching that the Wagner family did with Elizabeth as soon as they got back to Ohio, she testified about a time that she was sitting in the kitchen of the Flying W farm and that she was shown a picture of what I assume was Jake's hand, but of a hand holding a gun. In this discussion were George, Jake, Angela, and Frederica, which is Billy's mother, Frederica Wagner, who was also arrested at the time. Piece of shit person. So there's that. They showed Elizabeth this picture of a person holding a gun and asked her what she saw. She said that the hand looked like Jake's that was holding the gun. She was quickly reprimanded, and then they made her very loudly say that she didn't know anything about the photo. She didn't see anything in the photo, anything like that, because this family was so convinced that BCI was listening to everything that they did. She said that she was not allowed to leave the home by herself, but inside the house, the Wagners fought often and loudly. She described the Wagner family as stressed and said that she had never heard anyone shout like that before in her life. She also testified that the brothers would sit and discuss things that they would do to certain members of law enforcement should the opportunity ever present itself. The kind of bullshit like, oh, I'd kick his ass type of thing. Except they decided that they were going to create some kind of bulletproof tank, some kind of electric weapon that they were going to use on Mike DeWine, who was the attorney general at the time, later became the governor, and then Ryan Scheiterer, who was the BCI agent in charge of the whole thing. She didn't mention Charlie Reeder, but I assume he probably came up in this as well. Charlie Reeder was the sheriff of Pike County at the time, in case you aren't aware. They also extensively discussed what would happen if any one or all of the members of the family were arrested, namely who would take care of Sophia and Bullvine should that happen, and also who would handle the family finances, because at this point their finances were completely intertwined. Of course, in true Angela fashion, she has to get involved in her son's sex life and butted heads with Elizabeth about that. Saying that they shouldn't be having sex right now because sex was only for having children and that now was not a good time for Sophia to have a sibling. She being Angela, also asked Elizabeth if her and Jake had ever had relations while Sophia was in the room with them, and that sort of behavior was inappropriate, which is the one thing that Elizabeth and Angela agreed on, and we can all agree. She, of course, thought it was inappropriate. Jake didn't agree, and Jake did, in fact, do that. So go to part 8. Testimony of Elizabeth Armour, part 8. So Angela, of course, being this weirdo who's obsessed with being poisoned, she eventually ended up accusing Elizabeth of poisoning Bullvine and Sophia. She being Elizabeth, had testified that one night she made tacos for the family, that everybody really liked them, which of course pissed Angela off. So then she claimed that Bullvine and Sophia had diarrhea, and that clearly Elizabeth had spiked the tacos to give, or just didn't know what she was doing cooking wise, I guess. But claimed that she had given food poisoning to Bullvine and Sophia with the tacos. Naturally, it didn't stop there. It ultimately went on to, again, trigger warnings with the shit with the kids, even though this wasn't true. Eventually, there were accusations made. Jake brought it to Elizabeth's attention that she was being accused of touching Sophia inappropriately. As a result of this, George said he was not comfortable with Elizabeth living in the house with either of the children. So there was a confrontation about this at the kitchen table in the house in South Webster. And basically, Jake told her that he didn't believe she had done it. But Angela said she did believe it. And Jake then began questioning her and laid out very clearly what would happen to her if this was a true accusation, or even if they believed this accusation to be true. And he said that the right thing to do, quote unquote, would be to create Lucille, which is a reference to The Walking Dead, again with the fucking Norman Reedus. But he would create Lucille, which is a barbed wire wrapped baseball bat that one of the characters used to beat another character to death. There's a really famous scene. I'm sure you know the one I'm talking about. But he would beat her with Lucille, then string her up in a barn, use the bat to beat her to death. He said they would then bulldoze the barn on top of her and burn it. Jake also made it a point to tell her that if he didn't do it, Angela would. If Angela didn't do it, George would. And if George wouldn't do it, Billy would. That ultimately, this would be the fate that she would come to if they determined that this was true. He said any of them would be willing to do it because it would be the right thing to do. On hearing this, Elizabeth said she went to her room and packed a bag and called a family friend, and go to the next part and we will go over that. Elizabeth Armour Testimony, Part 9. Elizabeth stated that after this confrontation, she called a friend of hers who, long story short, talked to Jake and basically told Elizabeth she was overreacting, typical Christian bullshit that pastors and shitty church members pull. Elizabeth decided that she was going to get out of this marriage at this point, and she was no longer allowed to be alone with the children. Her things were being rifled through on a regular basis, and then they would bring it to her attention. And then they found the diary. Now, Elizabeth kept a diary. She didn't write Dear Diary. She wrote them as letters to her grandfather, who she called Granddaddy, who had passed away. And she said that Jake had actually suggested it to her as a way to cope with, everything, I guess. But in this, they found a lot of things, but the main thing they found was a list of 15 reasons that Elizabeth did not like Angela. She didn't like various things, like the fact that she had her hand in Jake's finances, that she held the child care over his head, that any kind of help that she had ever given him, she held over his head, that she would always threaten him, that she would see to it that Sophia would prefer her, and that sort of thing. And then she also, of course, told the same thing to Elizabeth, that she would make sure that Sophia never saw Elizabeth as a mother. And God love this sweet little religious girl. God love her. So in the same letter to her granddaddy, in her diary, she laid out her plan to crush her. Number 1, treat her only kindly and respectfully. Number 2, try to become her friend. She's like Rhonda, so she really only respects working buddies. I don't know who Rhonda is, but I'm sure that's relevant. Number 3, be nice because I'm bigger than her. Number 4, once I have her trust and friendship, slam that relationship door shut in her face. Yes, bitch. Yes. Yes. Absolutely. That is a perfect plan. Love you. Good job, bitch. So ultimately, the family found the diary, made her burn it, and flush the ashes down the toilet. However, they did have a couple pages of it in court that day for her to read. Elizabeth testified that the family operated as a unit and said if one family member had debt, every other family member was expected to financially pitch in towards the debt with no choice. Angela, in particular, demanded gifts and compensation for caring for Bullfine and Sophia. I have never been in a group of people who had finances this way, she said. Go over to part 11, maybe 10. I don't know. Elizabeth Armour testimony, part 10. Elizabeth stated that the family did everything together as a unit, from finances to jobs to life choices. And Jake told her that they took turns making the decisions and that right now it was Angela's turn, that he had had a turn, George had had turns, Billy had had turns, and that eventually, if they learned to trust her, she would have a turn in the future making the decisions. So ultimately, she suggested that the family send her off to college. They had a family meeting and it was decided to be best, mainly because my dog wants to go outside with my son. Sorry, he's whining. Hold on. Ultimately, it was decided that Elizabeth should go off to college. Don't know how that came about, but it did. So 3 months after moving in with this hellacious group of people, she ran away. So she started going on walks and secret trips to the branch of the Portsmouth Public Library that is in South Webster that I guess was within walking distance of their house. So on these trips, she started calling her father in secret because she had unsynced her phone from Jake's at this point. And she would also call the woman that had been her maid of honor in her wedding. And ultimately they came up with a plan. Elizabeth told the Wagner family she was going to meet her friend who would take her. Oh, okay. I just confused myself. Elizabeth told the Wagner family that she was going to meet her friend who would take her off to this college in another state that would ultimately seclude her from the BCI. So the first week of July in 2018, Angela and Rita drove her to the Jackson Walmart in Jackson, Ohio, and dropped her off inside the Walmart. Elizabeth said that she changed her clothes in the changing room and snuck out to a back entrance through the tire section, which I've been to this Walmart, is on a total opposite side of the store from the main entrance, like most Walmarts. She was afraid she was being followed, basically. There was a rental car at that entrance with her father behind the wheel. He drove her side roads, back roads for miles, hiding the car for a bit. They went to a restaurant where her friend picked her up in a different car and drove her to Virginia. I'm curious if they said she was going to Liberty because that's where I went to college and it's a church college in Virginia. She has been in hiding ever since this and does not want people to know where her whereabouts are. Not long after this, BCI did manage to get a hold of her. She told the courtroom that she did cooperate with them, including doing a recorded call with Jake, even though it didn't amount to anything. So head over to part 11 for cross-examination. My whole part on Elizabeth Armour's cross-examination didn't record. I'm so pissed. All right, so we're going to do part 11, which is the cross-examination. I've already closed my notes, so we're just going to go off of what I remember. John Parker did the cross-examination of Elizabeth. He, as always, is an asshat. I can't stand him. I hate the way he talks down to the women that are on the stand. He did the same shit with Tabby, and I didn't appreciate it. He asked her about a brain injury that she had. She corrected him, said it was not a brain injury. She had sudden unexplained death in the right prefrontal cortex, I believe, of her brain. He tried to insinuate that it would cause memory loss. She corrected him and said no, that the only thing it had affected was her ability to remember names. But at this point in her recovery, it didn't even affect that. I forgot to not hit record, so you got to hear my whole yawn. Anyway, she said this happened in 2020. It was not prior to it, and she had already talked to BCI at that point. John Parker also tried to insinuate that the reason she thought that the Wagners were so loud was because of her upbringing as a Mennonite Amish community, which are known to be soft-spoken, to which she said, I think it would be shocking for anybody. He also tried to say that she didn't like George because George and Billy had talked about prostitutes and joked about getting prostitutes when they were on the road. Also tried to ask if any of George's friends had ever bothered her, and she said really the only friends that she remembered were Chris and his partner Randa, which is Chris Newcomb and his partner Randa, and only because they lived next door. He then asked her the dumbest question I've ever heard in my fucking life, which is, When did you know your marriage was over? To which this petty bitch, in the best way, deadpan response to this asshole. I knew my marriage was over when they threatened to murder me. That's about when I knew. That's not a quote. I've already closed my notes, but that's pretty much what she said. She said, when they threatened to murder me, I knew my marriage was over. Good for you, bitch. Good for you. Fuck him and his shitty line of questioning. Good for you. So anyway, that's all I remember off the top of my head. I don't think there was anything else that specifically needed. He asked, never mind, I remember now. So the defense, of course, was pissed that she didn't want to talk to them, to which she was like, the Wagners terrify me. I don't want to talk to you. She's been in hiding since she ran away from them, and she doesn't intend to come out of hiding now for the Wagners. So go see the previous part that I posted too soon. We're going to vote on how you want me to do Jake's testimony because he's the only witness for this week. All right, so we are all caught up with all of the witnesses except the ones from this week. And I say ones, it's only one. The only witness so far this week, today is Wednesday. I have been, of course, watching the trial. Not that it does any fucking good, because the only witness we talked to this week is Jake Wagner. Jake Wagner took the stand on Monday morning. He is still on the stand as far as I know. He opted to not be recorded or audio recorded. So we are stuck going on the reporters that are in the courtroom, and they are not even allowed to audio record it. They have to take like handwritten notes. So there are a lot of people who are in the courtroom. There's a lot of content creators who have actually gone to the courtroom. There's obviously reporters. The podcast people are in there. The lady from YouTube is in there. I'm not going up there. I have a fucking job. Like, sorry, I would love to be in there and hear all of this, but I would rather watch or listen to it. But I don't have that option right now. So my question is this. How do we want to do the Jake testimony? Do you want me to break it down day by day? Like at the end of the day, as we've been doing, or every couple of days as we've been doing, or do you want me to wait until he is finished and do a comprehensive series of everything that Jake said? Because like I said, I don't have to watch this. Sure I understand. My watch thought I was talking to her. So like I said, I can't watch this. I can't listen to this. I'm going to be going off of summaries and reading tweets. There is a lady, Courtney Francisco, that I'm going off of, who is in the courtroom for WCPO, Channel 9 out of Cincinnati. I think it's Channel 9. I don't know. Out of Cincinnati. And I'm going off of her tweets. She's doing a very good job. And obviously every reporter under the freaking sun that is able to get in there is in there. So I'm going to not start it tonight. If I start it, it'll be tomorrow. So comment down below. Send me a message, whatever. Let me know how you want me to do the Jake testimony, if you want to do a day by day or if you want to do a comprehensive one whenever he's finished. I don't know if today's his last day. I was reading the tweets from today, and they're to the point where they're after the homicides. But they're talking about subpoenas still. They're not even to the point that they're arrested yet. So I am going to go on a limb and say that he's probably going to be the only witness this week, or at least the majority of this week. So like I said, let me know down below. We'll get into that. And I'm going to make one more video about the ruling about the audio. So go to the next one. All right. So we're going to play like the attorneys and have a sidebar conversation here, but it's literally going to be 3 minutes of me talking about what happened in court, and not a single thing is going to change. So yesterday, in the middle of Jake's testimony around lunchtime, there was a ruling that came down from a higher court, basically saying that any witnesses that wanted to opt out of being recorded or photographed or audio recorded, basically that the judge would have to have a hearing to prove why they would need to be opting out, and that he could rule whether they would be able to opt out or not. Naturally, we all got real excited thinking we were finally going to hear the Jake Wagner stuff, and that we would get to hear the Angela Wagner stuff. Yeah, it turns out that's not what happened. So yesterday when this came down, they came back from an extended lunch break, which Judge Randy Deering used to help interpret the ruling because it came right before lunch. He came back and said that they weren't going to change anything that day and that they would hold a hearing this morning at 8:30 about any further steps that need to be taken. So this morning they had a hearing with an attorney that represents several of the news medias that want to film or at least audio record Jake Wagner's testimony. And basically nothing came of that. So essentially, they decided this morning not to change anything regarding Jake Wagner because they were in the middle of his testimony. And that the continuity of that could cause problems. It could cause like reason for appeals. It would be too complicated. And believe me, I wanted to see Jake's testimony as much as the next person, but it was just going to create too many problems. And also for some reason, the prosecution was really against him being on there. Probably because he had already not been filmed and they felt that this was just going to open it up to a further appeal. They also said that they were afraid that he would be less open and honest, which isn't the whole point of the fucking oath you take to negate that. So they decided not to do that with Jake. And then about 2 hours ago in the courtroom, the court issued another, what was this called? A new order modifying the one issued Tuesday that basically says, oh, yeah, that thing we said yesterday, yeah, about that, never mind. Carry on as you were. So that was a big fucking waste of time for no reason whatsoever. So here we are. So I'm sorry, as of now, we are not going to get to hear Jake or Angela's testimony. Go vote on how you want to hear Jake's testimony. I'll see you.